right, this is my final bookshelf on my current bookshelf tour here. So these are my 3 shelves. It starts with the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we have gone through 1000 AD, Greeks and Romans, 1000 AD, going through the Renaissance. And as you can see, I have a bunch of books on the floor still I haven't been able to put up. And we go through the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and we end in 1899. So that leads us to the year 1900. And this whole top shelf precedes World War I. So everything you see on this top shelf is before World War I starts. And so just go through a couple of these here. Owen Wister started the Western genre of fiction, really. There were some things here and there, mostly memoirs of, trappers and different people, explorers, that kind of thing. But the Virginian is really the first genre Western that started the whole trajectory, and it was published in 1901. A lot of times I think people get the impression it's a much older genre, but really it was 1901 in our modern kind of fantastical version of what the West was like. And then Rilke up at the top there, the Book of Hours. There's really not a good edition of this, but I figure bilingual edition is about as good as it gets. So, lovely book. I love Book of the Hours. Then we have Hugo von Hofmannsthal. He got very famous when he was young, like in his teens even, kind of another Rimbaud character in the sense that he had a very high poetic skill when he was very young, and then he ended up getting into plays, as you can see there. These are his poems and verse plays, and then he also wrote prose plays, essays, and prose writing. NYRB publishes the Lord Chandos letter, which is mind-blowing for what it is and the time it was written. So if you haven't read that, check that out. Princeton, this is the Bullingen series. They also do his, publish his prose, but these are kind of hard to come by anymore, these hardcovers, so I got lucky with this one. Henry James, later novels. And then we have a few Russian books here. Petty Demon by Sologub, and then the symphonies. This is Andre Belly's first works, prose symphonies. Raoul Brandão, The Poor. I haven't talked about this one in a while, but this one left a strong impression on me. A Portuguese novel from the, I think maybe 1905 or something, but very striking character portrayals of poor people, which is rare in literature, oddly enough. Zuleika Dobson, I just got this. Haven't read it yet, but I remember Alexander Thoreau talking about it in his interview with Michael Silverblatt, and it stuck in my mind, and I've heard other people talk about it. Max Beerbohm, I've read his poetry before, but never read his prose, so I'm sure it'll be enjoyable. Alfred Dublin, Bright Magic. The Murder of the Buttercup has stuck in my mind ever since I read that. Then we have early poems of Ezra Pound, Jean Christophe, Romain Rolland won the Nobel Prize, and Anatole France also won the Nobel Prize. And this is the craziest. The Gods Will Have Blood, and it was published in 1912. Crazy. So I thought it appropriate to end right before World War I with The Gods Will Have Blood. All right, and then we get to classic modernism. So when people say modernism, this is the shelf you'll think of. So I have Dorothy Richardson, the first part of her Pilgrimage series, and go to Andre Belly, Petersburg. I have 2 translations of this one too. It's kind of like what I talked about with Dead Souls. I feel like no matter which translation you have to read multiple to understand something like Petersburg, and Petersburg even more so than Dead Souls, I imagine. The translation is, a faint mirror of what you actually have in the original, but You got to do what you got to do. I'm probably not going to learn Russian in my life. And Wyndham Lewis, Tar, the 1918 version by Black Sparrow Press. E. Powys Mathers. This one's probably a little less common, but he wrote, so these read like kind of, let's see the names. These read like Oriental poems, as you'd say in his time, or, you know, Middle Eastern poems, Far East poems, but they're all from him. But if I remember correctly, he wrote some poems as if they were translations, you know, like it was a new Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam or something. But they weren't. They were just his creations. The Escape of the Notorious Sir William Haynes. So that book inspired Patrick White's Voss. It was a novel. It's a novel about a travel in, you know, the heart of Australia. And Patrick White really liked it. Wittgenstein's Tractatus, little known philosopher. T.S. Eliot's Letters. And that's where I'll remind, so I do have a favorite shelf, so I have the complete poems of T.S. Eliot and, you know, Wasteland and so on, but those obviously are on my favorite shelf. But I tried to keep at least a placeholder if I didn't have the complete works of someone. So my placeholder for T.S. Eliot are his letters, his first volume of his letters from 1898 to 1922. Some fascinating stuff in there. And of course, The Wasteland was published in 1922, so covers the period preceding that. And then a lot of my Joyce stuff is on my favorite shelf, but I kept the Dover facsimile, 1922 facsimile of the Shakespeare and Company edition. Ulysses annotated. If you guys saw, there's another annotations for Ulysses. It's only in hardcover. It's 1,200 pages and $130 or something. I've been meaning to get it, but prioritizing other things right now. But anyway, Marilyn French, that's probably my favorite, apart from maybe Hugh Kenner. Yeah, apart from Hugh Kenner. This is my favorite study of Ulysses. I usually, I'm pretty picky with studies, to put it mildly, but this one's actually good, actually thoughtful, and I feel like you can get something out of it apart from just, you know, justifying wasting pages. Emmanuel Carnevale, I still haven't gotten those editions published by Jacob Seifring and Joshua Roths up in, what's the press called again? Sublunary, but it's not, that's the side. But anyway, so check out Emmanuel Carnevale's complete works, got published recently. I'll put a link in the description for that. The Fugitives, some of my favorite American artists from the early 20th century. So that includes people like John Crow Ransom, John Gould Fletcher, Alan Tate, Andrew Little, Caroline Gordon was in there, and Robert Penn Warren's probably the most famous nowadays, but yeah, amazing stuff. Donald Davidson did the introduction of this. He was one of them too. All Southerners. Magic Mountain. I've been meaning to read that a lot more recently because I'm reading this history, Pandora's Box, history of World War I, and he frequently quotes Thomas Mann and Robert Musil. So Musil's one of my favorites, and I've been meaning to read Magic Mountain for a while. Tried to read it a few years ago, but I didn't get hooked on the first 30 or 40 so pages, so I just put it away, but it's high time to go back to it now. And then Marina Tsvetaeva. Marina Tsvetaeva is one of my favorites. She's the best Russian poet of the 20th century, in my opinion. And then Hugh MacDiarmid, Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle. He makes fun of T.S. Eliot and James Joyce in there. Karl Kraus, Die Fackel, The Last Days of Mankind, his satirical epic play. The new translation of Macunaíma is out now, so if you wanted to get a copy and you couldn't get a hold of this one, because it was pretty rare at the time that I talked about it first, you can now find the new translation. It's not simply a reprinting, it's a whole new translation. So Juna Barnes and Wallace Gould. Wallace Gould is a fascinating poet. I talked about him years ago, and I've been meaning to make a newer video about him, but he also has another early work that you can't get in physical copies anymore unless it's one of those really cheap reprints, but it's called Children of the Sun, which is really amazing. So I might talk about this Aphrodite in depth a little bit more. And we have another Wyndham Lewis, Apes of God. This one's kind of neat. So W.B. Yeats and Ezra Pound wrote to Isolde Gone, so Maud Gonne's daughter. And let's see, I think it'll say it on the front. It's a girl that knew all Dante once. And yeah, just look into the relationship if you haven't heard of it before between Isolde Gone and W.B. Yeats. It's an interesting relationship. And then Evelyn Scott, The Wave. I also have A Calendar of Sin, which is pretty hard to come by nowadays, unfortunately. But Evelyn Scott, just to give you some context, at the time she was asked to write a blurb for Faulkner. And this was in the late 20s, early 30s. So she was well known as a thoughtful, creative writer at the time, and Faulkner was up and coming. And Czerniansky, Balkan writer from the late 20s. Virginia Woolf's The Waves, my favorite Virginia Woolf. Just recently bought The Years, and that one looks really fascinating. It was published in 1937 first, so I kind of connect it with Finnegan's Wake as far as the time frame. Vicente Huidobro, Altasor. Paul Valéry, I love Paul Valéry. His Monsieur Test is on my favorite shelf, but his poetry is awesome, and I really like this edition. It's bilingual. Miroslav Krleza, Croatian author, The Return of Philip Latinovics. Robert M. Coates, The Eater of Darkness is his first work, which is unbelievable. And then Yesterday's Burdens is excellent as well. Neskio, Amsterdam Stories, one of my absolute favorite books of all time. An amazing, amazing set of stories about what it takes to be, you're not an aristocrat, but you want to make art. What does that take? What do you do? I just remember when I first read it, I was, working, about to go to college, and it just was 100% exactly what I needed at that time. T.S. Eliot's Essays on Metaphysical Poetry, another Karl Kraus play, The Third Walpurgisnacht. The Folks by Ruth Succo. So I just found this recently, another Iowa book. But yeah, as you see here, The Nation, Saga of the American Middle West. And one of my projects recently, this was published in 1934, one of my projects has been to try to find more novels not from California or New York. And even Chicago is a little bit overblown if you go back far enough. But, trying to find novels that aren't from the wealth capitals of the United States. And so finding, of course, Faulkner is one of the standouts. Of course, McCarthy is one of my favorites, who's not from there. But then you have, people like Ruth Succo, and then you have the Fugitives. They're all from the South and forgotten about generally. And then, broadening it out, Ulysses from Dublin. Where is Dublin at anyway? So then we got our Hungarian crazy guy, Miklos Senkouthi, Prey, both volumes 1 and 2. Freytag Loringhoven, Body Sweats. The Uncensored Writings of Ilse von Freytag Loringhoven. Basically a female Dadaist. Check her out if you've never heard about her. Crazy stuff. Miklos Senkouthi. I don't have the St. Orpheus Breviary. The first one, I did have it, but it got bunch of ash on it. You can even see still here, it's a little smudged and stuff. But this one I remember, Miklos Kazantzakis Pre Volume 1. I got it as a reward for myself when I got into UT Austin, and I had to go to this pretty awful transfer mandatory meeting. Like if you were a transfer student, you had to go to this thing for a few days, and it was terrible. And so I told myself if I got through it, I'd buy myself Prey. And I did. I bought Prey, so that's what I was reading when I first got to UT. But anyway, Karl Kopik, first use of the word robot. He came up with it. Thomas O'Crowan, The Islandman. This guy was born in the 1850s in a small northern part of Ireland. If I remember correctly, am I saying that wrong? The Bay of Dingle. He's from the Bay of Dingle. Oh, it might be the southwest. Yeah, I might have that wrong. See, there's the map there. But anyway, yeah. Listen to this. To set down the character of the people about me, so that some record of us might live after us, for the like of us will never be again. Can you think of a better reason to write a book? No. Reminds me of the Story of the Stone. That's exactly what he wrote about. Olaf Stapledon was friends with Virginia Woolf and the Bloomsbury Group. He's a sci-fi writer. This is the first reference to a Dyson sphere. They should call it a Stapledon sphere. But basically surrounding a star so that you can fully capture all the energy that star gives off. It comes from this, 1937. Amazing. All right, then we have Vallejo, my complete bilingual translation. I have the hardcover of it. It's on my favorite shelf. Osip Mandelstam. This is his biography. Mandelstam is, depends on the day, I might say he's tied with Tsvetaeva, but at the very least, I would put him second in my personal opinion as far as best Russian poets of the 20th century. And maybe third, I'd put Pasternak. William Butler Yeats. William Butler Yeats. He's kind of crazy because he was born early, 1860s, and then he lived to start of World War II, which is just pretty insane, the scope of his life. I've been meaning to read a biography of him just to see what he thought about things. We have Miklos Kazantzakis, the second volume of the St. Orpheus Breviary. Nikos Kazantzakis, the sequel to the Odyssey. Mina Loy. I have Mina Loy's poetry as well, but I didn't have room up here for it. And we have all my Finnegan's Wake materials. Symposium. This was all put out beforehand. So this is the Stuart Gilbert, Frank Budgeon, William Carlos Williams, Samuel Beckett famously referenced, Dante, Bruno, Vico, and Joyce, Eugene Jolas. So important stuff. If you like Finnegan's Wake or if you want to get into it, read that. This was basically written to try to convince people to read Finnegan's Wake, to trust Joyce, as if you needed help trusting Joyce after reading everything else he wrote. Yeah, these are the Finnegan's Wake materials I think are worth getting. This, just kind of see the historical milieu, and then annotations. This is the best copy. If you get the 4th edition, it's, for some reason, it's blurry. I don't know how they managed to mess it up, but it's blurry. So get the 3rd edition if you can. And then How Joyce Wrote Finnegan's Wake, a genetic history or genetic biography of Finnegan's Wake. It's fascinating to see because he wrote it over, 17 years or so. And we have Faulkner. I have Sound and the Fury elsewhere, but I've been meaning to read Absalom, so I have this up here on the shelf. Walter Benjamin, The Arcades Project. I have that there because, of course, it's unfinished, and he wasn't able to work on it after he died trying to flee Nazi Germany. Neidhart, Cycle of the West. He wrote a series of narrative poems about the trappers and mountain men in the American West. John Neidhart, he's most well known for transcribing Black Elk Speaks. So you might recognize the name from there, but he was also a poet, a fairly good poet actually. I've always liked his poetry. Then we have Kenneth Patchen, Rainer Heppenstall, and then Thomas Mann, Dr. Faustus, amazing book. And then this one here, Luis Cardoza y Aragon, Pequeña Sinfonia del Nuevo Mundo. I got that recommendation from Andre, the Untranslated. And we're getting to late 1940s, early 1950s. Herman Broch, all my other Herman Brochs on my favorite shelf. The Guiltless is kind of my placeholder for his stuff. Cesare Pavese, Disaffections and the Business of Living. This Business of Living is an amazing memoir, diary, more of a diary really, journal, not a memoir. But yeah, House of Breath, recent favorite, Texas writer. Robert Penn Warren, I think he's most well known for All the King's Men, but then he wrote other historical novels and then excellent poetry. I don't have it up here because my first edition got ruined, and then what I replaced it with is a totally messed up ex-library copy that I got for like $5 somewhere, so I don't have it up here, but I have it around. Herman Broch's essays. And then we have Alan Tate, John Crow Ransom, and John Gould Fletcher. They're all fugitives. They lived pretty long. John Gould Fletcher, sadly, killed himself when he was in Arkansas and moved down to Arkansas. As you can see, Arkansas publishes this. But John Gould Fletcher is an awesome poet. He went to England, if I remember correctly, yeah, when Ezra Pound was there, and they knew each other. They weren't friendly really, but they were kind of competing, I guess you could say, in the poetic idiom of the time. John Crow Ransom's an awesome technician, and then Alan Tate puts it all together, and he's just excellent. Then we have the Angel Crespo translation into Spanish of Gran Sertón Veredas by Guimarães Rosa. The Last of the Bohemians, which is just a crazy book about Leon Paul Fargue, French playwright. I think one of the things I really like about putting things chronologically is you see that, you know, Gran Sertón Veredas is within years of the recognitions, which is within years of Carlo Emilio Gata and Kerouac. Not a fan of Kerouac really, but it's more there for historical purposes. And then we have my last shelf. This is where we really start running out of room. So I just have some stuff haphazardly put, just to give kind of a variety of what I have just for myself. But we have Gottfried Benn, who really wrote his best poetry when he was younger, but it continues till the 50s, so that's why it's there. Boris Pasternak, poems from the mid-50s. Jorge Luis Borges. I was trying to decide where to put his stuff, because my favorite stuff that he wrote was written in the 40s, but he kept writing into the 50s. Basil Bunting, amazing poetry. If you haven't read his stuff, definitely check him out. Louis Zukofsky, not one of my favorites, but he's worth reading. He really gave it his all, and he's an interesting writer. We have Archibald MacLeish, collected poems. Robert Frost, gotta have Robert Frost. Carotid Cornucopias by Sidney Goodsir Smith. Crazy book, inspired by playfulness of Finnegan's Wake. We have Lord of the Rings. Paddy Chayefsky, that's a bit out of order. That should be in the 70s, but as you can see, it starts to open up here. Marguerite Young collected poems, Cantos of Ezra Pound, Maximus poems of Charles Olson, which are really interesting. And then we end with the big boys, School for Atheists and Arno Schmidt's Bottom's Dream, which fits on this shelf. I haven't had too many shelves where that will fit on, but it does. So that is the end of my bookshelves I have, and I ran out of room. I do have two favorite shelves in my other room, but definitely, ideally, to fit all my contemporary works, which probably going to end up getting rid of some of those in the near future. I'd need at least another shelf to fit all my novels and poetry that comes after. You know, realistically, this shelf would end maybe in 1960, and then I could fill this up with a little bit more stuff, and then I'd maybe start with the 70s on the top of the next shelf. But yeah, so this is a good smattering of stuff that I have. It's more comprehensive the higher you get up there, and then when I get further down, I just kind of picked interesting stuff or stuff that I want to preserve, things I don't want to have in boxes or on the ground. So yeah, let me know what you think. There's definitely some interesting stuff on here, some stuff that's a little bit rarer or harder to find. So if you see a book on here that you haven't heard of, check it out. You might think it's neat. All right, well, that's the end of my bookshelves, end of my bookshelf tours. And death is a gang boss.